Hello, my name is Kevin Lindegaard of Crops for Energy, and I'd like to welcome you to the third Biomass Connect webinar, Biomass Crops, Some Interesting Alternatives. So as frequent attenders will know, generally what I do is I introduce the talk and I give a bit of background about Biomass Connect, and then also bring in the panel, and then there's a Q&A session. At any time throughout you would like to make to have a question, please use the Q&A function, not the chat, the Q&A, and I will do a moderation of the questions of the panel at the end there. In addition, at the end, we'll have a little session on coming soon, all the exciting events and other things that are coming on the horizon for people interested in all things biomass. So, as I mentioned, the Biomass Connect website, this is a veritable beanstalk. If you travel up that beanstalk, you will get to gold in the form of information and knowledge. All things about biomass and all these exciting events. So please navigate to biomassconnect.org and also subscribe to the newsletter. Similarly, if you are watching on YouTube now, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and give us a like on the buttons below. So biomass crops do come in all shapes and sizes, and we're going to be dealing with two at the very extreme here today. So on one hand, we've got eucalyptus grown in short rotation forestry. Now these majestic trees, when allowed to grow to their full maturity, can reach sometimes 90 meters in height, which is quite amazing. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got a much more modest biomass crop, reed canary grass. Now, in this situation, you get maybe 1 to 2 meters of height, a lot lower, but still it can do a job for you. And making the choice of which crop you grow is all about your situation, and it can be down to your soils, your climate, your fields, your topography, your facilities, your lifestyle, your age, and of course your market. So, moving on to the speakers, we've got a great panel here, John Hawkins of Bagber Farms and Bryan Elliot of Eucalyptus Renewable. Now, John Hawkins has been growing reed canary grass for the best part of a decade now, and I've got to say he's probably one of the most switched on farmers I've ever come across. And also, he's not only switched on about reed canary grass, but also in terms of the policy, and he's fast becoming my phone a friend whenever I've got a question about policy. Chances are, before I even know about some of the tomes that come out from DEFRA, John has already read it, deciphered it, and has got all of the important information to be able to pass on, which is great. So it's not what you know, it's who you know in many situations. So, John, please, without further ado, could you tell us a little bit more about reed canary grass, this very interesting diversification option?
Thank you, Kevin. That's a very generous introduction. Welcome this afternoon to a little insight into a crop that's generally considered a weed by many. Many traditional farmers like myself would often have looked at reed canary grass in the same bracket as something like sterile brome. And if you look at the slide in front of you, that is reed canary grass in the foreground, but in the background, you'll see a homogeneous crop of spring barley. And your average farmer wouldn't really want a rhizome, such as reed canary grass, growing in that monoculture crop. However, times are changing. Kevin very kindly explained that, yes, I do have a good finger on policy. It's pretty challenging because it seems to change weekly, but it looks like the English government and perhaps the devolved governments in due course are moving on a new journey in terms of different crops we can grow. Now, obviously, we all know about miscanthus, etc. But obviously, reed canary grass sits with the other grasses. The reason why I looked at reed canary grass was due to a number of reasons. The first one, and primary one to point out, is that as a tenant farmer, if I were to plant my farm in trees and arguably other permanent crops like miscanthus and willow, I would need landlord permission. And we've indeed done that and put 5,000 cherry trees. However, there's a limit sometimes to how far a landlord will let you plant up alternative species to monocrops on arable land. And their reasoning is, well, I'm a tenant, so I'm going to be slightly biased, but their reasoning is that it can possibly reduce the value of their asset in their perception, or has done in the past. But equally, into the future, I think those are areas that government will address, which allows us to grow a far more diverse group of plants and products for fuel and various other jobs. So reed canary grass, you can see the picture on the screen, is a rhizome. It's a spreading rhizome, and it builds its energy as a perennial plant from the roots. The other thing about it is it doesn't last forever. It will probably last 7 to 10 years, as we found. It's the sort of crop a tenant could grow. It's a little plug here, but the government have currently called it a permanent crop, which is not fair because it's a grass. And it can tie in with all your other biomass crops out there. So if they're going to ask us to start splitting up fields with agroforestry, etc., then this could tie in as the lower canopy, whereas the higher canopies could be mixtures and strips of other biomass crops. And the thing I really like, because I'm not a landowner and a tenant, is it's cheap. It's cheap to establish. You then get a crop from it for a multitude of uses, and you can destroy it and return it to whatever your landlord wishes to do with the land once you've finished your business on their land, which could be decades or it could be a short period. So a quick look at the production cycle. In the first year, we plant it exactly in the same way as you plant any crop. You get a good seed bed, and then you basically it sprouts from rhizomes. It can be outcompeted by other weeds or other crops in the first year, like many plants that are perennials. So it's really important to manage it very, very well in the first year if possible. After that, in years, it's also doesn't really produce very much yield in year one. So you almost want to treat it as a fallow crop, or certainly make sure you've saved up enough income to afford that establishment year. We'll come on a bit more about how you can afford the product. And then obviously it grows up, reaches, maybe it's in feet this, but up to 2 meters or 7 feet. It sets a seed which shatters. It can then regrow that seed and fill in gaps. And after time, it can become quite a major monoculture. So where you choose to plant it and how you plant it is important. And as I said, we ourselves have actually returned large swathes of it back into an arable rotation in order to prove, if we wish to expand the area in future, that it can be returned to arable or grassland cropping in due course. So production costs, very tricky, obviously, in the current climate, but if energy becomes more in demand than food in this country, then things like biomass crops will have a greater value. However, we're not putting all our eggs in one basket because it's a perennial crop and a rhizome, and it has different cutting times to arable crops and is more resilient to weather patterns. It's actually quite a multifunctional and cheap crop in order to establish. You can see here some examples of how you can harvest it. It doesn't tend to lodge like other grass crops, which is why it's probably perceived to be more permanent, because other grass crops, when they lodge in wet weather and strong winds, lie on the ground and then begin to rot and get wet. Reed canary grass has a very upright habit, and therefore it stays standing. And the picture on the left is how we ourselves harvest it with existing arable machinery. But equally, if you were doing large amounts, or your setup was more livestock based, or your contractor had the equipment in the picture to the right, then you might adopt that method. But really, you have to look at what product you're going to turn it into before you decide, one, how much you're going to plant, to how you're going to harvest it. Will it be annual or biannual, or even triannual? I hate to use the phrase. How will you dry it if it's not perfectly dry? And then what will the end product be? So let's look at some of those products that you could turn it into. We ourselves have turned it all into round bales. These round bales fire an RHI powered boiler, and it can burn up to 4/5 of a ton, so 4 bales per 24-hour period, generating heat for RHI. But also you could put a CHP plant on it and upgrade it quite dramatically as and when those options may or may not come forward in future. It's quite crude, the RHI. I think this is quite an intelligent plant that could be used very efficiently. It does have a downside of high ash, but it also, when it's hot and dry, can be scrubbed and the ash can be returned to your own farmland, thereby closing that same sustainability loop, which I think is very important. And that's certainly the way we as farmers are being driven to establish our own net zero goals first, and then hopefully having spare capacity to assist all other sectors who find it much harder to achieve. Excuse me. So there's a number of things you can do with the dried product. You can mill it down and then compress it into pellets or briquettes. That would be fine if you need to move it further away than your own farm, say to a local power station for a school, a hospital, or whoever requires alternative power. And then something, you know, rather than putting, again, all my eggs in one basket, another option that happens, especially in Canada, is it's used for grazing livestock in the early spring when it's still green shoots, and only certain varieties can do that. But also you could make it as bedding, instant bedding. So instead of having to bale it and store it in a barn, if the weather was dry enough, you could pop out and cut it and take it straight to your barn for your livestock to be bedded down on, because it does have some good absorbency properties, but not necessarily eating properties when it's the winter months. But obviously livestock have supplementary food. Okay, but the real winner with it, I suppose, is environmental credentials. It does lock down a lot of carbon dioxide. We've been doing tests and trials with our local water company, and I suppose that's what led us originally, I should have said at the beginning, into choosing Reed Canary Grass. They wanted to sponsor water and nitrogen leaching mitigation measures on our farm, and that picture on the top right shows that. The bottom right shows Reed Canary Grass next to a watercourse buffering an arable field. And both fields are actually arable fields, but those are the buffers we've used. From that, we found that no nitrogen at all really gets leached anymore, which means if you needed to get rid of animal slurries and dirty water at the right times of year, it could be irrigated into this crop, thereby saving an awful lot of storage area and creating something productive. But those are just ideas for the future, depending on government policy, etc. The other thing it does is soil restoration. So we are definitely seeing, where we've returned it back to a cereal crop, a massive increase in the carbon, soil organic matter. And that's fantastic. We're getting good crops after it. And so it shows if you have degraded land, this is an excellent crop. If your land is already in very good heart, you'll get higher yields. But really, it does make a big difference. I won't go into detail because the experiment isn't finished, but it's a fantastic soil restorer. Habitat, people often say it's not, none of these biomass crops are good for habitat. I totally disagree. I think if you spread it out and you leave room for nature, whether that be around headlands, around strips, and don't cover the entire field from hedge to hedge or wall to wall with one monoculture, you can create an incredible biodiversity from these things. And also don't try and harvest it all at the same time, because that biodiversity is going to struggle to survive with no habitat. It does clean up the water because it does act like a giant filter and it stabilizes the soils. And I won't go into details or show you hundreds of pictures of the wildlife, but if you have good wildlife in your area, it will only enhance it, whether that be small mammals, birds, and all the raptors that then even eat the small birds because you've created so much habitat. So it really is an exciting crop, and we look forward to further support, both private and publicly, in the future, alongside and with agroforestry products. Thank you, Kevin.
Excellent, thank you, John. That was a most illuminating story that you gave there. That's fantastic. So I've got a couple of quick questions. With the permanence issue, I mean, is that just a name? It's like a term. It's not going to really affect how it's viewed by your landlord, or hopefully by the funders in due course. I'm hoping anyway.
Absolutely, Kevin. I mean, it's quite common in Kent for people to grub out fruit tree orchards after 20, 30 years, but they are very clearly a big permanent tree. But with grasses, we found we were able to get rid of it within 12 to 18 months. And back to exactly the same field that could grow a cereal crop, and it was not a pernicious weed. Now, obviously, there was a certain chemical product available to do that. It would be much harder to do without glyphosate, but there probably would be other ways, but probably less environmentally friendly. But yeah, no, I agree with you. There's no reason why my landlord shouldn't let me do this, as long as I can promise to return it to the condition they let me the land in the first place in.
Super. Just a couple of questions on the nitty gritty. When I've read reports in the past about reed canary grass and switchgrass, there was something about the germination rates of some of these seeds. Have you ever had a problem with that at all?
I think you'll find germination rates on any seed is about timing. So if you don't have the right temperatures, moistures, or soil conditions, anything can lack in germination. We haven't found that yet, but we hope that as long as it's a viable seed, that you will get an infill effect from the second year, where that viable seed will infill the gaps. And we certainly saw that. But yes, there's always an issue with making sure you have high quality seed, regardless of what you plant, definitely from the beginning.
Okay, and one other question. The fact you're putting nitrogen onto it through the wastewater and everything like that, do you ever get any, the growth being so tall that you end up with a lodged crop? Do you ever see it leaning over or anything like that?
So we haven't actually put wastewater on it ourselves, because we're in a nitrogen vulnerable zone, and I don't think our water company would sponsor that. However, yes, I think there's a danger, like with any plant, if you overforce it and add too much nitrogen. Certainly with our arable crops in the past, now we're using very little nitrogen, but in the past we'd put too much on and they would go flat. Whereas now they never go flat. So if you don't force the crop too much, and perhaps only use a small amount of wastewater, or do it in very small cycles, not all at once, you shouldn't get lodging. But don't quote me on that, obviously, if that happens to yourself.
So thank you very much, John. Now we're going to move on to eucalyptus, as I said, the other end of the spectrum on biomass crops. Now, these are incredibly fast growing. It's true that they're not from around these parts. And that does mean that there are certain questions that need to be answered about them. And Bryan's going to do his best to do that in due course. But what these trees are particularly adaptable to UK conditions. They really do love it here, and there's a number of different species that in a horses for courses fashion can do very, very well in different parts, all the way up to the north of Scotland. So Bryan will be he's going to give us the what, when and how of planting the right tree in the right place. Now, just an intro on Bryan. He's been in the forestry game for about 30 years, and in that time he's planted about 750,000 eucalyptus trees and around about 7 million trees in general. Now, considering the amount of CO2 that these fast-growing trees suck out of the atmosphere, that puts Bryan right at the front line in the fight against climate change, but also makes him a net zero superhero. Now, he's not wearing his cape today, but don't let that fool you. So without further ado, Bryan is going to give us the lowdown on eucalyptus.
Kevin, thank you very much. That was really weird. That was great. Thank you. A lot of people on the webinar know me quite well. They know that I'm just a silviculturalist, and all I do is do trees and do silviculture and understanding the trees and how they work. Now, eucalyptus as a species is really unutilized in UK. And when I started looking at it about 7 or 8 years ago, I actually worked out why, and it's all to do with understanding the physiology and the morphology of the trees. So it can work if you do the silviculture right and focus on the detail. Just as an introduction, the largest use for eucalyptus in the UK is primarily as a feedstock for renewable energy and also for firewood as well, which is ideal. And it is absolutely suited for short rotation forestry as a biomass crop because it produces a very high yield at a very fast growth rate. The wood produced is very high density material, so the cellulose is put down at a very quick rate. One of my areas that I'm dealing with down in Cornwall, I'm doing permanent sample plots, and we're pushing 48 cubic meters per hectare per annum, and the trees are just growing like hell. It's fantastic. Because the wood is high density, it's well suited to combustion, so it actually works really well. So it's an easy one to harvest and easy to get going. There's a lot of continuing incentives from the UK forestry industry, from the UK government, and it's going to work from that perspective. And let's go on to species choice. There's about a dozen species that actually work really well in this country. And primarily, it's the species related to where they will match the climate conditions from the original provenances. So nightens will grow along the southern parts of UK and South Wales, but not much in the Midlands. You've got other tree species that are suited there. Glaucescens is much more tolerant of cold temperatures, and that fits all the other aspects. There's other tree species like Rodway, which has got a parameters of being a swamp gum, so it fits into very wet areas, and it grows really well in certain locations through Wales and also in Scotland. So as a species, there's about a dozen, and each species does a different thing. And often the cold tolerance means that the provinces they've come from is basically because they've been at a high elevation, and that restricts the rate of growth that the trees have evolved to do and create. So the nightens is very high production, and it produces big leaves which are much more vulnerable to frosts and wind and elements like that, which actually slow the tree growth down. So it really is looking at the different site requirements and sand and salt tolerance. All of these aspects come into it. So it's very critical about getting the right tree that matches that site. And then the next thing is looking at the actual species and how they fit with objectives. So we've got about a dozen tree species, and I'm always pushing the boundaries in terms of getting tree species in that'll do different things. You see the slide in front of you, that's Glaucescens with the round leaves. The round leaves are mountain gums. They're truly suited for surviving cold temperatures. They're quite happy down to minus 18 degrees. This is one of my wooden creation sites. You can see the lines that we've actually cut. I've got a plough which is opened up the soil. As soon as you open up the soil, you're reducing the compaction. A lot of wooden creation relies on planting into fields, and there's a certain amount of settling or compaction. So I really advocate putting ploughs down or ripping to open up the soil so that the white roots, once they get out of the plugs, they will actually start moving and create anchors. The tree shelters are quite good because they're nets and they don't restrict the growth of the trees by creating a in the summer a greenhouse effect, and in the winter where they just fill up with water. So they respond to their external environment. And it's very hard work for trees to work in woodland creation situations. The trees themselves have evolved to be in a forestry situation in amongst other trees, so putting them in a field is a very foreign place for them. Now, the first and foremost priority is looking at your end objectives and what you're trying to do with the trees. You're looking at biomass, and often the best way to move forward is to create a microclimate. That microclimate is generated by the stocking, the species, and how close you can get. The sooner you can get the trees to create canopy closure, the sooner the trees start hitting their strides and start moving very, very quickly. That's the greatest rate of growth. So they've all got this magic area that each of the trees have evolved around. So this is why it's important. We set it up to plant the trees, and as soon as they start competing for that light, they start slowing down growth. So they put an energy into moving away from their competitors. So we really need to start fitting beyond that. So this is going on to the next step. When you're looking at planning, you're looking at crop end objectives and when you're going to thin it. Also planting, comes back to what I said about site selection and the species choice. There's an EIA criteria, which is environmental impact assessment. Generally, it's in the region of 0.5 per hectare that you need to, beyond that, you need to get an EIA criteria, and there's various different levels of environmental impact assessment that has to be carried out. It's relatively straightforward. There's a different set of EIA criteria up in Scotland, and with the planting, you need to look at the landscape. And a lot of the great woodland creation sites that I've got, the impact of landscape is priority. It's one of the aspects that drive us and make sure it fits. And physically, when you're looking at the planting, you need to do the pre-plant work. You need to get everything lined up with the subsoiling, and then it comes down to the species, the detail in terms of the plant passport, making sure that we've got plant health registration is all in place. We've followed all the legislation we've needed. And what's quite important is using, within the woodland creation system, there's you get grants for tree guards, and the tree guards work really well because, pure and simply, they help us locate the tree, and also primarily because of the rate of growth. When you open up the soil, the roots try and set an anchor, the wide roots start growing, but often if you don't do the subsoiling and open up the ground underneath, the roots don't keep up with the top growth. So to make sure that this works really well and a lot easier is to use tree guards. And because it's grant funded, it's quite easy to use. It does change criteria. If you're looking at no tree guards, you'll probably want to plant more trees so that the impact of climatic events, wind and the like, have less of an impact. But then by planting higher stocking, you need to thin it out sooner. So you're definitely looking at age 4 to start removing material. And at that stage, you're probably looking at about 16 tons per hectare, thereabouts. We'll look at the yield potential. This is a site which is, it's just 4 years of age. They're coming out the top of the guards quite well. We don't need the guards. The guards have done their job. Now, the most important thing for me as a silviculturist is looking up into the canopy and seeing what the hell is happening up there, and the competition that's been generated by the existing trees. And it's a fine balance because you want the trees to work as an entire population, so the canopy moves with any climatic events, which are wind. Wind is a dramatic effect on especially eucalyptus trees. So in this situation here, you'd probably be looking at maybe a year or two more to start looking at doing any sort of thinning intervention. And doing a thinning intervention, you need economic scale. So this is why you're probably looking about at least 2 or 3 hectares, or probably 5 hectares to make it economically viable. But as a silviculturist, I'm looking at that stand and I can see that there's light coming through, and you look to the left and right and you can see that there's light also. But another aspect is you're looking at the underneath the trees, you're starting to see an accumulation of leaves, and the leaves are generally juveniles, and they'll start dropping. When you start seeing an accumulation of leaves underneath, it shows the tree's under stress, because the first line of defense, the trees are under stress, they'll drop their leaves, which is against competition, against wind, against cold temperature, and also against fire. It's a survival technique, and generally most trees have got this. Okay, the on the site here, I'm going to start doing permanent sample plots. They're just enough old in September. They're just old enough to start that process, and I would guess that we're looking at in that point there, the standing volume would be about 45-50 cubic meters per hectare standing. The basic wood density is quite high. At this stage, it's exactly the same as oak. Oak sapwood is about 500, which is the same as Douglas fir. When you get hardwood development in about 7 or 8, it starts developing the hardwood. The wood density goes up the scale. It's about 700, so it follows oak. The key aspect there is looking at the canopy and juggling the canopy to get the best out of it, so that your trees are thriving. These trees here are Eucalyptus nitens. The whole point of what we're doing is to produce wood cellulose. Wood cellulose, and the rate of growth is immense. The yield ranges from the glaucescens to the highest one, which is nitens. Now, the more fertile the site is, the quicker the trees grow. So you've got a situation where on one of my sites down in Cornwall, I'm achieving pretty much 50 cubic meters per hectare per annum. Now, the rate of growth is driven by having a canopy which is thriving. So it's that thinning interventions which are really important, getting that balance right. If you open it up too much, you're going to have trees under stress because they're moving too much in the wind. So it's just managing the light around the trees so you get in the right sort of light around them. So you get a proper forest situation, and you're encouraging the trees to put on diameter and keep growing tall. One of the best things about these trees is that once they get to a certain stage, they are, you just use normal harvesting machinery from timber operations. The tree on the left, one that's 12 centimeters, is from Cornwall again. It's Lanhydrock Estate, and it is 3 years of age. So, and the most important aspect that it just produces wood and biomass material that seasons really quickly as well. So you put it up, stack it up, and it seasons really, really quickly. Okay, this comes back to that point. This is one I've got down in Cornwall. That material which is sitting there, we weighed it all, and there is about 35 tons of material there. Now, as a guess, you'll probably look at it and go, actually, maybe that's just an articlo, but it's very heavy wood. And the trees to the right are 6 years of age, and this is in Trewater, which is one of my better sites, because purely and simply, the farmer, the landowner, is just committed to just following the things that we're talking about. So it's a good site. I'm using that as a primary example of what I'm doing, and a lot of the other projects that I've got are starting to catch up. A lot of the trees, probably over the last 3 years, I've planted about 3 million trees. About 300,000 trees. Wish it were 3 million. And we're starting to accumulate volume of trees, because prior to that, the numbers of trees 10 years ago, we're probably looking at about 10,000 trees being planted per annum. And now I'm looking in the region of 120, 180,000 trees per annum planted. So we're starting to accumulate volume. So, and then it comes back to the wood supply chain. So it's all moving forward. This biomass opportunity is going to work. So we just need to push it and get the silviculture right and understand the dynamics of silviculture and these trees and how they work and operate. And you'll be pleased to know that I'm almost finished. All of these sites are relatively recent sites. Some of them are the Midlands. There's a few sites there that the trees are just thriving, they're happy and healthy. And it's just getting this balance right. my sole objective when I'm planting these trees is to get canopy closure. Canopy closure means that the trees are protected from the cold. As always, it's a microclimate-driven aspect. Now, so at the end of the day, I've actually got two conclusions. The first main aspect is I tend to use what's called complex silviculture, which complex silviculture is understanding the dynamics of the trees and how they work and operate. And it's actually not complex in how you look at it. It's actually complex in how the trees operate. So it's quite simple. It's all about creating the habitat and the opportunity for these trees to thrive in. So it's just understanding it and looking at it when you need to thin, when you intervene with thinning, and it's that focus on watching the trees and letting them tell us what needs to happen and creating an opportunity for that to happen. So, and that ties up with the simple thing of all the other aspect of conclusion is there's nothing special about these trees. They just respond to simple silviculture. It's just really, really simple. There's nothing different. It's all about silviculture done on time, simply put. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryan. That's great. And knowing how passionate you are about eucalyptus as a genus of plants, and I know that you could talk about them all day. You've done remarkably well to keep that to about 15 minutes, so well done. The good thing is that there are plenty of things left unsaid, which means that there are plenty of questions I can ask you about that. So I'm just going to ask you a couple, and then I'm going to bring John back into the fold, and then we can have a proper panel session. So just a couple of things about the nitty gritty there. The stocking rate. So what is the spacing between those plants in those pictures you were showing?
Basically, they vary, but generally that's 1600. 1600 is the bare minimum, and to be honest, that's the bare minimum that we should be planting native broadleaves at as well. It's got to be 1600, 2000 stems per hectare, because otherwise you're just sitting in a field situation. Any tree, it's an alien environment. To actually achieve canopy closure sooner, which generates a microclimate where the trees are going to thrive in, you'd probably want to plant as close as possible. But really, 2,500 stems per hectare is about the max you really want to do, and that's at 2 meters by 2 meters, which is quite close. You're forced, if the trees are not going to be stressed out, you're forced to actually really do the thinning. It depends on the species, in the location, the rate of growth. You're looking at maybe 4 years, 6 years. Glaucescens in the Midlands, I'm doing 6 year start of the thinning intervention, but we started off at 1,600 stems per hectare. It's about a balance in terms of how the trees are thriving and the microclimate. The most vulnerable time of all these trees is the first couple of years before they get canopy closure. So that's the driver, is canopy closure.
Great. Okay. One other question before we go to the panel is when you harvest short rotation forestry, what happens next? Do you allow it to coppice, or do you plant in between the stems that you've harvested, or do you try and allow just one new stem to grow? What is the regime for doing after you cut it?
I could talk for ages on this one. When you get a coppice stool, what happens with a coppice stool? There's the light encourages these trees. There's a whole lot of buds in the stems under the bark. So what happens? It buds up. So you get the tree, which is say 7 years of age, whatever species it is of eucalyptus. They all tend to be very, very very able to coppice right through 15 years of age. But say at about age 7, you cut the tree off, it'll actually come up from the stool with multiple leaders, and you'll end up with having 100 different leaders. So you've got to control that, because they're all competing. You're going to end up with, if you leave it to nature, you're going to end up with at age in another 7 or 8 years time, you're going to end up with another dozen stems coming off that. So that stool, that root structure is feeding a dozen different leaders if you leave it to nature. So the problem is, because they grow so quickly, the root stock is in the ground, the engineering connection to each of these stools, each of these stems is quite weak. So if you thin it out too much, if you only leave one leader, you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and if that snaps off, because there's a lot of movement and the trees will actually move quite a lot in the opening, so it's to a certain degree, it's the same magic space rule where you've got to leave a certain amount of space for each of the leaders within that off that stool, and the stool has also got a life of maybe 3 or 4 rotations, so it becomes defunct after that time. I'm just scratching the surface on that. There's a lot more we can talk about.
Okay, great. So we'll bring John back in now for the main panel session. So the question for both of you, I don't think you really mentioned the dreaded disease and pests. Are there any diseases and pests that affect reed canary grass and eucalyptus? So over to you, John, first, if you could come back in.
Well, I think you'll find pathogens, pest and pestilence and disease affect absolutely everything, including our dear selves as humanoids. But yes, of course, reed canary grass is a grass, and so it's probably susceptible to some of the wet and warm fungal infections that the UK would receive. So in a colder or drier climate, they're probably less susceptible to pest and disease. I've seen nothing that really concerns me, but yes, you can't possibly say they're immune to all pest and disease. They will catch something, possibly. My advice would be managing it using the tools at your disposal, and that's a different debate.
Is there any possibility of having a mixture of reed canary grass varieties in order to do something like that?
I might look like an encyclopedia, Kevin, but that is beyond my botanical knowledge at this juncture, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Well, that's maybe where Biomass can help in due course.
Yeah, I mean, if in the world of wheat and monoculture cereals, they are trying to grow multiple species together so that the stronger ones outcompete the weaker ones. So I would imagine diversity there would be a positive factor. Yeah.
Excellent. So Bryan, disease and pests of eucalyptus whilst in the UK.
Yeah, it's because it's a different climate to where they normally grow, and because the trees have evolved around constraints of lack of moisture and lack of nutrients, which luckily or unluckily we've got a lot of both. So, but at the end of the day, the cold tolerance of these trees is actually constraining a lot of these potential pests that are there are some. There's a tortoise beetle and a few other bits and pieces, but there's not the economies of scale for these very specialist type pests which hit the normal forestry plantation environment. So we're quite lucky. If we're going to go further and increase the amount of area planting up in eucalyptus, would be looking at it again, but seriously. But then, with economies of scale, this is always going to be a niche product, and it's going to be grown as a mixed part of the whole robust species that we as a forest industry are growing. So it's not a big element at the moment, but they're all there, and I've got the knowledge of what there is.
And in terms of mixtures of eucalyptus, how far can you go? Can you go every other plant something different, or would you always have certain blocks of them together?
No, just chuck it all in, just whatever it is, whatever comes out of the bag, just plant it all up, because at the end of the day, they're all going to respond differently. So to a certain degree, having robust mixtures is going to be a robust, strong way of growing these trees. So that you don't tie yourselves in. It doesn't matter, because the actual wood cellulose is the same for all these different trees. They just grow at different rates and they respond to different climatic events. So the more robust and mixed we can make them. But obviously you want trees on the edge of the plantation which are more exposed, that have got a greater cold air tolerance. But then you create a microclimate inside the plantation where you can actually plant quicker growing trees, which is actually the nature of how we do plantation. So silviculture is what it's all about.
Excellent. Okay, moving on to the question of invasiveness. Now I mentioned that eucalyptus are an exotic, but reed canary grass isn't always in all of the different habitats. So I just wonder whether there is any chance of these two different, radically different types of biomass crops getting out into nature and into places we don't want them. So, John, I'll ask you first.
Well, I almost want to pitch that question back at you, Kevin, and go, where don't you want them? Because they naturally grow in nature around watercourses where they can also become an invasive species. So if you've got unmanaged watercourses, there's a great danger of blocking them up with reeds. Canary, it is a reed. It's the definition of invasive, really. I would say with mechanical intervention, anything can be removed, frankly. We won't necessarily have an argument on chemical intervention or next to watercourses even, but it should always be absolutely the top of people's minds to work out what they're going to do. And if they need to leave a buffer because they're not sure that it could spread, then they need to manage those buffers. And I would say that with any crop, really, you shouldn't butt it up where it can spread easily. Wildlife's an issue. If wildlife picks up seeds and birds pick up seeds, they will deposit things in other places. But equally, one man's weed is another man's crop. So a weed is merely a plant in the wrong place. So it is an entirely controllable product at this juncture in time. So incorporating it intelligently, like any other crop, would be my advice to anyone to avoid it becoming a problem to others.
And Bryan, do eucalyptus, are they fertile in these conditions? Will they seed?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're always fertile, but the seed's really tiny, and their evolution process is tiny little seeds. So what happens is that it's generally based on a fire regime, and the fire explodes the seed pods, and what happens is it creates an ash bed underneath, and with the fire going through, and then it needs a total ash bed. So there's no competition of grass. So to be honest, there's 2 or 3 sites where I've seen natural regeneration occurring, but you actually need almost like a perfect storm. It doesn't really operate because there needs to be no weeds for that to happen, and then they'll start regenerating. But the thing is that as soon as we've got any open ground, the northern hemisphere ground just gets habitated by grass straight away. So we need a fire going through, which is probably one of the topical things going to hit me in the future in this webinar about fire. At the end of the day, fire is all about fuel load. So if we come back to the fuel load that these trees have got, it all comes down to thinning and intervention. So the better we manage them, the better we take out the material, the greater the canopy, the deeper the canopy, the less dead material there is, and there's nothing to burn. It's all about fuel load. So anywhere you hear about fires with eucalyptus, you look underneath the ground, underneath the trees, and you'll see the trees are very spindly. There's a little bit of green on the top, and you've got a fuel load underneath. We're so desperate for wood, biomass material, the cellulose material, we're going to keep thinning it so that the trees have got a deeper crown. The trees are not under stress. They're not dropping their leaves, limbs. It's all about fuel load. And that's the only way that fire will go through these crops. So at the end of the day, there's very little difference between the fire potential of eucalyptus trees in UK than any other tree. And even so, pines have got a greater fire potential than eucalyptus have. So, sorry, next one.
Okay, great. We've had a question about yield. John, what is the yield of reed canary grass per hectare per year?
So in the first year, you might as well count on 0 and accept that it's a bonus, and you just need to think outside the box and do payment stacking to work out how you're actually going to establish whatever you're growing. Reed canary grass trees I don't care, because they're not instant yielders like monoculture cereal crops or milk. After that, and don't quote me on this, but 5 to 7 tons per hectare on good, well looked after soil is a reasonable yield. Equally, if you want to save the planet, cut it every other year, because you'll be building your soil and taking that yield. So therefore the average yield could be half that. And people are going, oh, but I can do really high yields from other things. But if you take Newton's third law of relativity, you'll find out that matter can neither be created nor destroyed. So the more you take off, the more you've got to put back. So it's about closing that gap. And so actually, if you're taking off something that has a value or someone else values, then you might find it's more profitable than a very large crop of wheat, for example. So that's the yield bit.
So Bryan, in your presentation, you mentioned, I think it was 40 cubic meters per year in terms of the wood density, but also you had a thinning of about 35 tons. So trying to measure or compare apples with pears, what is a typical sort of average yield in tons to compare with John's 5 or 7 tons per hectare?
I'm talking about silvicultural interventions, and the thinning intervention, probably about, like down in Cornwall, we started off at age 4, taking out 16 tons per hectare, but 2 years later, we're taking out 25 tons per hectare. So we've got a 2-year intervention, and that's going to keep growing at the rate of growth.
So that's 25 tons from 1 hectare.
Yep.
And then if you divide it by the number of years.
Yeah, you divide by the number of years, but what's probably more important is that you're not impacting on the growth, the rate of growth, and the amount of wood being laid down or the cellulose being laid down. And then you get the rotation year end, and then you start going backwards and discounting from that point and including, and then you top up with the tons you've taken out with the thinning. The thinning elements are not great, but it's actually the accumulation of that volumes, that standing volume at the end of the year, because at the end of rotation. Because say if you're looking at a 15-year rotation, you'll be looking at in the region of 500, 700 tons per hectare. I've done thinning, I've done clear fells, well over 2,000 tons per hectare in eucalyptus, not in this country.
So it strikes me as is very, very difficult to compare from a grower's point of view. If they're sitting there looking at their piece of land, how do they make that decision at the moment, and what possibly could be in the pipeline to help them make that decision easier? So that's the question that's open to both of you guys, and I'm hoping you'll get the right answer.
There's an app that we should be using that's been developed at the moment by EnviroCrops, and looking at giving us the answers, because we're using data that I'm generating and forest research are generating, and all of these private trials we're using, and we're putting that into this app so that we've got an opportune situation so that we can actually look at different locations and we can come up with the answer. So this is one of the reasons why I've got this EnviroCrops. It's an app, so it's an opportunity. So, and that's one of the suite of different opportunities that we've got. The more information and the data that we've got, and this is the whole rationale behind these biomass projects, to get that information out so people are making the right decisions for the right reasons and have an expectation that's going to be well sorted, so that there's no guesswork. Our job is to have no guesswork. We know stuff. We need to know that these things are going to work. Our job is to say we need to know it, and we didn't expect that to happen. That's the worst thing that can be said. We've got expectations.
Excellent. So if you're interested in the EnviroCrops app, which the alpha release will be out in March, please log on to envirocrops.com and you can subscribe to the newsletter. The newsletter is quite different from the Biomass Connect one, but subscribe to both, because honestly you won't miss a beat if you do that. Now we've got a few more questions here, and then so let me just have a look. Okay, so someone has said silverleaf disease badly affected the coppice eucalyptus trial in the UK in the 1980s.
Yeah,
Can be avoided by harvesting in the summer.
No, it's almost like a red herring. That one's, it's more about the trees and the health of the trees, the thriving capacity of the trees. It's certainly going to be an issue with the harvesting time, but it's more about reducing stress on these trees by opening them up. And we've seen that with larch, with Phytophthora. The more we thin them out, the healthier they are. So, and the same rule applies for all trees. So, but every tree has got a different magic area that we need to optimize. So part of that is creating a healthy environment, and that's based on knowledge and looking at the trees and seeing how they grow. And you see all the slides that I've got, you can see all the trees. They've got deep crowns. Deep crowns are healthy. So it's just an indication.
Now, we're going to plug the next webinar in a minute. You've already mentioned environmental impact assessments that are required for afforestation, Bryan. I was just wondering, John, is there anything that you need to do, anyone you need to inform the powers that be before you go down the route of planting reed canary grass, or is it like you can do what you want on your own land?
Well, obviously, if I'm well mannered, I will notify my landlords that that's my intention, especially as I'm on a long-term tenancy, not a short one, which is not really in the control of the tenant. No, there's absolutely no requirement for me to notify anybody other than I fill in a form every year notifying my government to the square metre what I'm doing with their land, or they won't support our schemes. So they are getting notification on the 15th of May each year, whether you're in a scheme or not, if you take £1 of their support. Let's hope they actually support biomass in the future now RHI's ended, because I think they'll be really missing a trick if they can't balance food and energy, i.e. food, fuel and energy, as a team effort. And that's what Biomass Connect is doing. It's trying to hopefully push a wider view rather than a monoculture at these policymakers. And I agree with that. You know, monocultures are not the future.
So another plug for EnviroCrops again. Both Bryan and John have been involved in writing the best practice guidelines that will come out for eucalyptus and reed canary grass, as well as willow, miscanthus, poplar and hemp, and in due course other ones. So another reason to subscribe to EnviroCrops. We have a question on the ploughing. If a farmer has been farming regeneratively, e.g. direct drilling for the last 10 years, and has really good soil structure, is ploughing really necessary ahead of planting?
No,
Any thoughts?
no, I'm just going to butt in here because I hate the word regenerative, because as long as you're putting more into your soil than you're removing, you're regenerative. If you're removing more than you put in, you're not. But you don't need to plough. You just need to get an established root or stem into that ground and look after it. If the soil's already healthy, you'll get a better crop. I don't know what Bryan thinks, but no, you don't need to plough. If you wish to plough, but you don't need to if your soils are good.
Everything's all about balance. I've got probably one last thing to talk about, is that I'm a great fan of agroforestry, and I know agroforestry, know how it works, and I think that mixing canary grass with eucalyptus trees is a really good mix, because the mature foliage hangs vertically and allows a lot of light to go through. So there is an opportunity to use that. The more robust and thinking outside the box we do, the better off we all are.
Wow, that sounds like a great idea. One final question before we just go to the what's on. Have you had any experience of eucalyptus logs blunting chainsaw blades, Bryan?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just the way the trees have grown. I've dealt with the machines, the harvesting machines in New Zealand. We've got and all around the rest of the world. They've got to change the angle of the machinery so that the cutting elements are at a different angle, because the way the tree grows, it picks up material which is in the ground. So you pick up silicates. So there is going to be that sort of element as well. It comes down to the drying out. Once you cut it down, you need to it's really important. Once you've cut it, you need to put it into the process of what you're going to do with it. If you're going to chip it, you need to chip it straight away. Its capacity to chip or to be made into logs or pallets or whatever, it's got to be done straight away. And the same rule applies for timber. In fact, oak is very, very similar in the way that it responds. It seasons really quickly down to a low moisture content, up to a few months, down to sort of 24% quite easily if it's sitting up in the sun very quickly.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. I have to say, you really know your stuff. I'm hoping that some of it will rub off on me. The great thing is that there is a chance to meet experts like Bryan at a couple of events coming up, and others like myself as well, who are dealing with various things. So these are Biomass Connect events and EnviroCrops events. There's a couple that are on the 7th of March there. They're not really conflicting. They're quite a long way from each other. One has me talk and Will McAlpine talking about willow. Bryan is down in North Curry in Somerset talking about eucalyptus, really interesting site there. The following day there's a poplar farm walk in Herefordshire at a Poplar Tree Company, which will be enlightening as well. And then on the 22nd at BGI in Bucks, there will be a wonderful array of crops, because they have willow, poplar, eucalyptus and different configurations of all of those crops. And then they're going to turn those directly into briquettes before your eyes, and also you'll be able to see their biomass boiler. So it's a really great opportunity there. Now, I do see that there is a lot of the north of England, Scotland and Northern Ireland that don't have anything at the moment, but please be aware that there will be events coming soon to your area. And if you want to see what's coming, then go to biomassconnect.org, what's on. In the next month, we're doing our 4th webinar, and it's going to be all about the regs, how to play by the rules when planting and using biomass crops. Now, this sounds like a little bit of a dry subject, but it's absolutely critical. Very, very important to know your legal position before you put the plough in the ground and put plugs or put seeds in the ground. And also, once you've got that product, how you deal with it, because if you get it wrong, it can really be a headache. So go in with your eyes open. And the great thing is that we've got another illustrious panel who will get rid of all the background noise for you, so you can make those right decisions. So just a note to say, these are the partners involved in Biomass Connect. So UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology are leading it, with a number of research organisations and a couple of commercial organisations like myself and BGI, and a note to say thank you very much to the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, DESNZ, for their kind sponsorship of Biomass Connect and EnviroCrops. Please connect with us as well. So with all of these different opportunities through the website, through the various social media handles like Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn, we want to hear from you. We want to get your feedback on what we're doing, and just keep you in the loop as much as possible. And I think without further ado, I'm just going to say thank you very much to John and Bryan once more. Thanks for attending, and please tell your friends about the next webinar, and see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.